So, welcome to Velocity's Bench to Market for April and this series. I'm really excited to have Grace Powers here, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Grace. And then, Grace, you tell me what acronyms I mispronounce and say incorrectly. The first one is the fellowship role, which I want you to then tell everyone how many fellows there are of this. I'll let you tell that in a moment. But Grace Powers is an independent regulatory affairs consultant. She founded Powers Consulting in 2017 to help medical device clients with regulatory strategies and submissions. Her clients have included universities, investors, startups, and mid-size medical device companies. Grace has worked 25 years she has 25 years of industry experience in medical devices, including research and development. She's previously worked in industry for Brookhaven Medical, Bard Medical, CardioMEMS, and I don't know this one, Novost, all in the Atlanta area. Awesome. She has leadership experience with managing regulatory affairs responsibilities related to all pre- and post-marketing regulatory activities and submissions. Her submission experience includes FDA submissions such as 510Ks, pre-submissions, Q-subs, 513s. I'm not going to go over all. This is amazing. Notice, IDEs, PMAs, and real-time reviews, 30-day notices, EU technical documentation. She is a true pro. She holds a bachelor's in biomedical engineering from Vanderbilt. We won't hold that against you that you weren't from Georgia Tech or Emory, and a master's from UCLA. And there you go, an MBA from Georgia Tech. Okay, Grace, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about yourself and kick it off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Powers. Here we go. I'm an independent regulatory consultant, just like Angela just said. I worked in industry, in the medical device industry for a long time before being an independent consultant, which is even longer than what's listed on the slide at this point. Most of my consulting work is in US FDA submissions, a little bit of MDR submissions and CE marking things. I do have some international experience from the industry side, but mostly from a consulting standpoint, it's for the US. So I am going to talk today a little bit about kind of the background of FDA, some of the history of FDA, definitions of medical devices, and then talk to us a little bit about classification of medical devices, and then kind of the two most common types of regulatory submissions, the 510K and the PMA. So I have a lot of slides. I think you guys are entering questions into the chat. And if there's something that we need to talk about in the midst of the presentation, Angela's going to let me know. Otherwise, we'll do a lot of questions at the end. So FDA background. Things have been changing a lot at FDA lately, especially in the last 100-ish days or so. So I went in a couple of weeks ago and pulled this. I don't think it's been updated since then, but I didn't check it today to just give kind of the FDA structure overview. So there's a lot to FDA. There's food side, there's the pharmaceutical and drug side, there's biologics like vaccines, there's veterinary medicine, tobacco, a lot of different areas. So you can see on here some of the different groups. Circled down there on the bottom left is the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. This is the area of FDA that I work in. So CDRH is what we call it. And so far, things at CDRH, although there's some less people there now, things overall, at least for my submissions for this year so far, are still moving along as expected. So that's good news. We'll see how that shakes out in the future. I always like to share a little bit about just kind of how medical device regulations came to be. And so starting off 1906, so regulations for some products have been around for quite some time. Upton Sinclair wrote the book, The Jungle, that talked a little bit about all the kind of grotesque and different areas for meat and food processing type things, which kind of, that book kind of spawned the first regulation. So the Pure Food and Drugs Act, that basically said you can't have misbranded and adulterated foods, drinks, and drugs. At this point, they weren't talking about tobacco, medical devices, veterinary. That all came a little bit later. In 1938, the main act, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is still the one that all the medical device regulations fall under today, replaced that and gave a little bit more information about how things need to be labeled, things along those lines. And it added in cosmetics and medical devices, just that they needed labeling, not a lot of details. Public Health Service Act came along after that kind of added in a lot of biological products and vaccine information. And then when we get into real medical devices, the first kind of standalone amendment to that act was 1976, that established the 3 different medical device classes based on risk and different regulatory pathways that they needed. And so that's the one that we're still operating under. That's the one that kind of invented the 510K pathway as well as PMA pathway. And then in 1990 was another big one, Safe Medical Devices Act, where facilities had to start reporting adverse events. It wasn't required before then. So if something goes wrong with a medical device or it causes an unexpected injury or whatever it may be, that was something that was had to be reported. So that's kind of the background there. Definitions. I'm not going to read this line for line, but the definition of a medical device is very specific. It is basically a thing. I always say that and people laugh, but often it's a physical thing. Sometimes there's no physical piece. It could be software or something. But the key differentiation of a medical device compared to a pharmaceutical is in the third bullet down here. It does not have its primary intended purpose through a chemical action. So a pharmaceutical would work through some sort of chemical action. A medical device does not, but still has some sort of impact on structure or function of the body. In vitro diagnostics are also considered medical devices. So I always think pregnancy test, COVID test, those type of tests, blood work tests that go off to a lab, things like that, depending on the lab and the situation, are considered in vitro diagnostics. It has a little bit of a different definition that's shown here, and that it's using a sample typically that's collected from the body instead of having some sort of action on the body. So medical device regulation and classification. So we have 3 classes of medical devices. So our class 1 devices are our lowest risk devices. You can see here malfunction or misuse poses pretty much no risk to life for the user. There's a picture of a tongue depressor there. We're going to go into a lot more detail about this in a minute. Class 2 is moderate risk devices. So if there's a malfunction or a misuse, it could harm the user. It may harm the user. Depends on the type of device. This is kind of the area of devices that I tend to work in the most. And then class 3 device, you can see there's like a LVAD there, a life-sustaining device for someone. These are higher risk devices. If there's a malfunction or a misuse, it could severely injure somebody. Potentially the patient, sometimes also the user is considered, the clinician in that sense. And so those are the class 3, the highest risk devices. So classification for your medical devices is so important because it determines your pathway to be able to commercialize your product. So these class 1, again, these lower risk devices are subject to what FDA calls general controls, and we'll walk through what some of those are soon. Generally, there's not a submission to FDA of like product specific technical information to be able to commercialize those. I will say to absolutely everything I talk about, of course, there's exceptions to all of these rules, just how FDA works, and there's more pathways than the things that I present, but this is kind of the overview in the time that we have. So we'll talk about those general controls, and then you can see the grayed out boxes. They don't really take a special review by FDA to be able to be put on the market. Those class 2 moderate risk devices typically do take a review of the technical information on the product, typically via 510K. 510K is the name of the submission to FDA. It's a pre-market submission you have to submit before you are able to market your product. And then these class 3 higher risks require also pre-market approval, which is a very extensive process where FDA is not only looking at your device and all the technical information about that, it's also looking usually for clinical study and information. And overall, it's looking at the whole company, the whole quality system, all of the different processes behind it. So a very long and extensive process. Okay, so back to class 1, lowest risk products. You remember the tongue depressor picture. Um, Here are some of the things that may be required for general controls. Establishment registration of the company. So that means I'm saying my company is Grace Powers Inc. and I am selling this type of device. Here is my location and here is my basic company information. To be able to sell a class 1 medical device, you pay a registration fee every year, a little over $9,000 for this year. No discounts for small companies. I get that question a lot. There are discounts on some other types of FDA fees. Medical device listing of products. That's basically saying, hey, my category is tongue depressor or toothbrush or stethoscope, whatever it may be. Telling them the type of product as well as proprietary and brand names of the product. So there's a link between the things that are out there on the market and an FDA establishment. For some products, it needs to be manufactured in accordance with good manufacturing practices. GMPs is what we call it. With those, it's basically having procedures that tell you how to build it, incoming inspections, information on traceability, materials, things along those lines. So having information on how your device is manufactured. It has to be labeled in accordance with FDA labeling regulations. Things like it needs to say the manufacturer's name. It may need to say its use. It needs to say if it's a sterile product or a non-sterile product. There's a long list of various labeling requirements. And then generally there's no submission required to FDA, but there's some exceptions that some class 1 devices do have an FDA submission. So here's some examples of class 1 devices. You can see the nitrile gloves on here. That's one of the rare class 1s that does need a 510K. It's still a low risk, but there is a lot of risk, right? If a glove breaks while somebody is working with a patient, there can be spread of disease, things along those lines. If a chemotherapy agent soaks through the glove and it breaks, then somebody could be exposed to that. Stethoscope and a sling. So class 1 devices are lower risk, not intended to be life-sustaining, usually not an implant. And about 41% of the medical devices, these are US stats for FDA, are class 1 devices. Here is an example of some of the information on how FDA classifies devices. This is actually written into the Code of Federal Regulations. So this example is an examination gown. I think we've all seen them. We've probably all wore them. It has basically a definition of what an examination gown is. Intended for medical purposes, made of cloth, paper, material, whatever it may be. It's a class 1 general controls, so it's stating that classification there as part of it. And then it talks about the pieces of the general controls that are applicable and not applicable. In this sense, if it's not labeled or representative as sterile, then it doesn't have to have good manufacturing practice requirements. Some people do it anyways, but it kind of walks you through what's required for the type of device. And there's thousands of devices listed in the Code of Federal Regulation. So next up is class 2, the special controls. So these are our moderate risk devices. So the general controls, like we just talked about, is not quite enough to assure safety and effectiveness of the device. There's other requirements that are out there, maybe things about packaging, sterility, biocompatibility. There's a lot of different topic areas. These devices typically have standards like an ISO standard or an ASTM standard for the product. There's often a lot of guidance documents, and we'll talk about that gives guidance from FDA on what's required to be in a 510K or for a specific topic area or specific type of device. They have special labeling requirements. That means things like there are instructions for use, there are specific indications for use that says what it can be used for. And these devices are often subject to post-market surveillance, which is kind of a big catch-all term for after things are on the market. Customers are going to have to take complaints. They're going to have to follow up with their data, ensure that there's not systemic issues with the product, things along those lines. It's a living product, and at that point the work is never done following it through the marketplace. So generally these types of products have a submission to FDA called a 510K that has a lot of technical information about the product, and FDA reviews that and gives a clearance when you're able to market your product. And we'll talk about what's included in a 510K after the classifications. So class 2 devices, moderate risk again. 43% of devices are class 2 devices. You can see spirometer here and x-ray here, Foley catheter. I feel like the range of different devices within class 2 is pretty broad, but you can imagine if one of these didn't function as intended, you could have misinformation, someone could get hurt, they could get extra radiation, whatever it may be in that sense. So there is some risk with those. Another example from the Code of Federal Regulation, this is just a catheter guide wire. And the reason I have this one in here is it has the definition, but under classification, it's class 2, like we're talking about, and then it says it has performance standards. So that means that there is a certain standard for guide wires. I mean, they have certain coatings with certain testing. The size terminology has to be the same so that, you know, when a clinician is in the cath lab or wherever they may be with a class 2 device, things are going to operate as intended. The labeling is going to be consistent across companies and types of things when they describe sizing and things like that. So here's an example of what this catheter guide wire looks like when you go to look up the product code. There's lots and lots of databases on the FDA website for product classification. It shows you on here, this is a class 2 device. This is the product code, which is just the fancy terminology for the category that it falls into. A few other things, but you can see down at the bottom, recognize consensus standards. So if you're working in this category, you would want to get that standard to know you have to do evaluation of particulates. There's guidance documents that talk about the coding is one. Another one is for performance testing. So there's a lot of information to know what's going to be required from FDA for that type of product if it has standards or guidance documents associated with it. There's last I pulled a little over, I guess, around 2,800 different guidance documents. This is for all types of, I think this one is actually just for the devices, but there's also plenty for pharmaceuticals and other areas as well. So there's a database on the FDA website where you can kind of sort by product type and category and things, but really the search function on the guidance document part of the FDA website is pretty good. So you can find some things that are applicable to you. You can sort through all of them. You can even download it and take a look at it. But that's a good reference to just kind of understand a specific topic. Here's just a random one that was published, 2017, but this type of product has, this is the information that you would need to put into the 510K for these diathermy devices. So there's all sorts of things that are out there. So class 3 products. So these are the highest risk products, sometimes life-sustaining, sometimes implantable, sometimes very critical information. It just depends. So they have those general controls, like I talked about in the beginning, special controls. So there's still going to be guidance documents and standards, but they also require pre-market approval, which is PMA. It's a more extensive submission process. Typically, these types of devices have a clinical study associated with them. They have multiple audits associated with them, audits of the manufacturing, audits of the company's quality systems, audits of the clinical data. So a very extensive process. There's not as many class 3 devices out there. 10% of all medical devices are class 3 medical devices. but a lot of effort to go into those. So you can see stents here. You can see how small they are on top of the fingerprint, to prop open a vessel, most likely of some sort, breast implant, implantable device, and then cochlear implant as well are some of the examples up there. So here's an example of a class 3 device. I put this one up very specifically because I like to use this as an example of you need to think about what you're going to say about your medical device because that can actually impact the classification. Claims is kind of the general term that we use to talk about things we say about a medical device. So this is about a contact lens, right? Rigid gas permeable contact lens, there's a definition. So classification, it can be a class 2 device if the device is intended for daily wear, but it's a class 3 device if it's intended for extended wear. If we were all in a classroom together, I would ask, why do you think that is? It's literally like could be the same thing, but why is that? Well, it's because there's a lot more risk associated with extended wear, right? You don't just take it out of your eye and trash it and be done with it. You have to clean it. You have to store it in the correct container. It has to be ensured that it can be worn for a longer period of time when it didn't just come out of its brand new package. Things along those lines make a difference on how a device may be classified. This particular combination of the same thing being class 2 or class 3 isn't as common as some other things, but it's definitely relevant when you're thinking about how to use a product. So because of this, when you note the class 2 or the class 3, like let's talk about medical device claims. Oftentimes when, I work with inventors or universities, whoever it may be, smaller companies, one of the things that we always talk about is with FDA, your regulatory consultant is going to try to find your least burdensome approach to get a product to the market. And sometimes what you say about your device may drive that. So here's an example that a friend gave to me many years ago to use. What is a claim? It's scientific information about a medical device. You kind of have to have substantiation for all of your claims because that's what's going to be out there in the world about your device. So it's important what you say. So this was the example. This is an electrosurgery device. And you can see it was designed for cutting, coagulation, and the removal of soft tissue as its indications for use. At some point, she was interested in saying, oh, can we specify a very specific tissue type and a specific disease state associated with that? But if you're changing something related to a specific disease state or saying that you are able to remove endometriosis or something along those lines, it may have a different classification because you may need clinical data to prove that that's the case. So that would make it a class 3 higher risk device compared to a class 2 moderate risk device where it just says it can remove soft tissue. And when it says something general like that, I like to call it a tool. That means a tool is something that a clinician can decide how to use it. They can decide what soft tissue needs to be removed and handle that. They get to practice medicine the way that they want to practice medicine. So really the point of this medical device claim slides is you really have to understand how you're going to describe your device because it can impact your regulatory classification as well as your strategy. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about is FDA submissions. I'm going to talk about 510Ks and PMAs. Some of the other ones, main submission types that you guys may have heard about are a de novo submission, an IDE for a clinical study, and a pre-submission, which is kind of an initial meeting with FDA, just what it sounds like before your first real submission. But we don't have quite enough time to get into all of them today. Okay, so the first one that I'm going to talk about is the 510K, typically for class 2 products, every once in a while for class 1 products. There's a piece of it that's not the most logical in my mind, but it's still what the process is. And that's kind of the concept of substantial equivalence. So a 510(k) submission, it's made to FDA to demonstrate that the device is safe and effective by proving it is substantially equivalent to a predicate device. So substantially equivalent means that it is similar to a legally marketed device that was not considered a high risk device. And so that's kind of a strange concept. So it makes, like, when you first think about it, to me, it sounds like maybe, there's no innovation or there's no iteration if everyone's just proving that they're equivalent to something else. Well, that's not really the case. They do have a very similar or the same intended use, but they can have different technological characteristics to get there. So you can see in this picture of this, I guess, balloon catheter, these are probably considered substantially equivalent if they have the same intended use. One is purple, one is green. Maybe they're different sizes, maybe they're different materials. Those would be considered different technological characteristics, but overall they have the same intended use and therefore the same safe and effective profile as each other. So that would be an example of a predicate device. So I'll talk a little bit more about predicate devices in a minute. Overall, if the device you're working on needs a 510(k), the first thing that you're going to do is do that device classification, like I was talking about, figure out a predicate device. The next thing is development process, drafting the 510(k), and then we'll talk a little bit about the FDA review process and the 510(k) decision. So when looking at device classification, there's about 1,800 now different generic types of devices grouped into different groups at FDA, basically departments of CDRH. These are the different groups that exist there, and there's plenty of databases on the FDA website to facilitate the searching. The search tool isn't the greatest, so using Google is usually a little bit better to find things, but you can at least kind of figure out what FDA panel or department you're in for those type of things. The next thing, and one of the hardest steps of this process, is figuring out your predicate device. I always use the pepper picture because I love the pepper picture to kind of show what a predicate device is. It's in that same product family. None of them are absolutely identical, different shapes, different colors, different characteristics, but overall they are all peppers, therefore they all have the same intended use. So this is a little more information about predicate devices. So when you're searching for a predicate device, again, it doesn't have to be identical, but think about the intended use, the design. Energy type is a big piece. Energy could be I plugged it into the wall or used a battery. Either one is usually okay. Energy might be something along the lines of therapeutic. And if no one's ever used that energy type before, maybe there isn't a predicate device that's out there. You can think about other things, materials, composition, manufacturing process, things along those lines to show similarities. And if there are differences between a predicate device, then you would want to show that that technological characteristic doesn't impact the intended use and that there's some scientific way to show that it's acceptable to be different. Finding a predicate device, knowing who your competitors are, what their indications for use are, searching the internet, searching the FDA databases, Googling it, all of those things definitely help you figure out what's in the space. It can be a little bit tricky because as long as they have an FDA clearance, you can compare to them. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're on the market or they've sold thousands of devices. They may have just gotten their clearance and licensed to someone or whatever reason might not be on the market. It's still acceptable to use some of those as a predicate device as long as they have a clearance. So drafting the 510(k). So you're going to put that classification and predicate device information in there. You're going to need copies of your labeling that FDA scrutinizes to some degree to make sure all of the information that's needed is in there. You're going to talk about your device, its specifications, provide engineering drawings, photos, schematics, whatever it may be. A lot of performance data, usability data, bench testing to show product doesn't fall apart, catheter doesn't break, sterilization information, sometimes animal testing, clinical testing, And then if there are specific guidance documents, often making sure that you comply with everything in the guidance document, and usually providing a summary of how you meet the guidance document is helpful for a speedy FDA review. Um, there are guidance documents on everything under the sun, labeling requirements, performance data, sterility, software validation, usability, cybersecurity controls. All of these things have to be considered if they're applicable to your device. 510K, we have a new format in the last few years called the eStar Electronic Submission Template and Resource, where you're filling in information about your device as part of it and attaching PDFs to it. These are some of the areas over here on the bulleted list that you can see are included in there. Cover letters, that indication for use statement, 510K summary, which is ultimately the piece of the 510K that becomes public when you get a clearance attached to your letter. You can see those in the databases if you're looking up other products. And then all of the things that we've been talking about: sterilization, shelf life, biocompatibility, electrical safety, if that's applicable, EMC software. They end up becoming very big submissions, thousands of pages a lot of times for some of them. Submitting a 510K. So you turn in this eStar as of 5 years ago. Thankfully, we can upload things to FDA instead of mailing them like we were doing for a while. You get an acknowledgement with a 510K number. Typically, they don't go on hold, and you find out who your reviewer is within about 15 days of that. There's a portal now that we can follow along and see FDA due dates. There's no real substantive information in there, but just kind of high level tracking. Typically around day 60, so 2 months after you've turned in your 510K, you get what I call an AINN. It's additional information notification, I believe, where you get a comprehensive list of the questions about the submission from FDA, usually by topic. They have completed their substantive review at that point. 2 months is pretty quick, honestly, based on all of the information that's provided. But when that file is submitted to FDA, it's assigned a lead reviewer. And I think of that lead reviewer as kind of like a project manager for the file. Like, they're going to send the biocompatibility pieces to that expert, whatever expert they need, cybersecurity, those pieces will go to them, and they're kind of coordinating everyone's review, also reviewing things themselves, usually substantial equivalence and labeling and kind of some of the more basic pieces that don't need SMEs, but you'll get back that full list of questions from FDA. And then usually at that point, it's a 90-day review is what FDA says for a 510K, but the clock is stopped. So around day 60, there's a pause while the company has time to respond. You have to respond within 180 days, which is not necessarily as easy as it sounds if there's testing or other things that have to happen in that time frame. But eventually the questions are answered and the clock starts again. So there's about 30 days left before you're able to get your FDA decision about if you've gotten a clearance, if they need additional information, if they're saying no, it's not substantially equivalent, which does happen sometimes, but you would definitely know it's coming at that point because there would have been a lot of questions along the way. And every once in a while, for various reasons, they miss the 90-day mark, and then there's some communication about that, but I would say that's pretty rare. They need to meet the 90 days 95% of the time. So this 510K pre-market notification outcome, you can, a lot of times if people are not able to answer the questions in that time frame because there's a major issue, they need to do a lot more work, they know that their testing is going to take 6 months and they're not going to be able to respond in time, they can withdraw the submission. Number 2 is the one you want, your FDA clearance, which means you're able to market your product. And then not substantially equivalent if it doesn't work, or they'll say it is not substantially equivalent because we still have these outstanding questions, and relist some of the questions that they had. And then you can go back in with another 510K and answer those at a later time or when your testing is complete. Okay, so the other submission type is a PMA, pre-market approval. This is for those class 3 devices. This is just kind of an overview of it because they're in depth on everything. So clinical studies are often required. You don't have the predicate piece device because you are proving your safety and effectiveness on your own. You're not comparing to someone else. So anybody that has a class 3 product has to pretty much prove that product standalone. There could be a heart pump A and heart pump B that already exist, but if you're coming in with heart pump C, you don't always get to piggyback off of their data. You have to prove that on your own and do your own clinical study. I often get asked about what's the difference between PMA and 510K. Well, it's definitely reflected in the FDA user fees. So the cost for a 510K to be reviewed is $24,000 for a larger company. That's the fiscal year 2025, 6,000 for a small business. Small business with FDA means you have to have a tax return for your company showing that your revenue is under $30 million, which is the case for most people that I work with. So we do the small business fees routinely, but you do have to go through a process with FDA to be designated a small business to get that discount. And so with a PMA, you can see $500,000 review for a bigger company. That's reflective of how much documentation and effort it takes on the FDA side to be able to do that review. 135K for a small business, but the first PMA review fee is free for a smaller business. When I worked at CardioMEMS, we were able to use the free business fee because it was a PMA product. So that's kind of nice, to just kind of help with innovation and offset costs there. With a PMA, goes through the same filing review and everything gets to FDA. Much more in-depth scientific review, regulatory quality systems. A lot of times they bring in outside experts, clinicians in the space, to do a review about the product, and then notification of decision. It says it's 180 days, but there's a lot of questions. So it's typically more like a year or two. So regulatory strategy timing is one of the things that I typically get asked about when I give these presentations. Like, how do I know what the right time is for me to do a regulatory strategy or consult with someone? Maybe, you have an idea or you have somebody that's knowledgeable in the space, so you have a feel for it. But I say it's a good time to do it when you kind of understand what your device's indications for use are going to be. I have a lot of people that are like, well, my product is a platform and it can do A, B, or C. And I love that. But like, which product are you going to do first? Because I can't assess a platform on its own because that wouldn't get an FDA clearance or an approval. We need to kind of figure out what the first device is and kind of understand that device's indications for use, as well as some of the most basic kind of design pieces, just to understand, especially if you're in the class 2 category, what can we use for a predicate device that's out there. Understanding kind of the details are really important when it comes to regulatory classification. I always say the devil's in the details. Like, you can't flip a word or change an area or anything at the last minute. It can really make your classification become something else. Maybe sometimes it's not a big deal, but kind of understanding what you want to be able to say about your device and your business and your market background is going to be important. Because if you can't sell your device unless you say XYZ, and I didn't know that as the regulatory consultant, it's going to be a challenge to have your strategy be correct, or we're going to have to do a revision to it. Generally, like a regulatory consultant, it's always going to try to do the like least burdensome approach. So maybe like the example I showed before, we can't talk about tumor or cancers yet, but we can talk about soft tissue. That'll get us on the market. And then maybe with that, you'll collect additional information to make another claim like that in the future, or, even change your classification based on that. So I think I'm talking fast. So that's the majority of what I have so far. It's 12:40. Do we want to stop for questions? And if we have more time, I can do more about digital health.
Awesome. Let's do it. And I think it's because you're an expert and you know this stuff so well. It was amazing. The one question that we had, and I wasn't sure if you had answered it, was goes back to the 510K versus de novo, basically. And so the question was, what if your product is truly innovative and the equivalent product is not similar in any of the technological characteristics? What would someone submit then in the 510K?
It's hard to say. This is one of those devils in the details type one also. Um, so if you really feel like, let's say there is an indication that's out there for a product, but the way that you're collecting the information is something that hasn't been done before. There's no other even areas, different than your different medical areas that are collecting information in the same way. It's probably going to fall under a de novo submission. And with the de novo submission, it is a little bit of a different format. You don't list out a predicate device specifically. You can talk about the various classification categories that are out there that may be similar. Like one that always comes up is like measuring glucose in a new way or whatever it may be. If you look at that, but nobody's ever used the technology, you're getting an endpoint that everybody understands what glucose is used for, but it would still fall under de novo if there's no technological characteristics or it's a technique that's never ever been used before. Um, if if the technological characteristics are, it's hard to say, all different, but maybe it's a lower risk device or a way that is more, I don't know, obvious, less novel in that sense. There may be some opportunities to draw from some different products that are out there to be able to show that there is something for a predicate device because it has a similar or identical indication for use. There's a little bit of art to it, and it's hard to say without knowing all of the details. So hopefully I answered the question.
Awesome. Okay, the next question is this one is regarding a class 3 PMA de novo application, so no predicate technology. And the question is if the technology has been validated in preclinical safety and efficacy studies, but no clinical studies as yet, at what stage do you seek a meeting with the FDA to decide on what additional data is needed?
Probably if you feel confident about your design, and it sounds like you may be, if there's some animal study data and some initial study data that shows if you feel confident about your design and have an idea in mind on what type of clinical information would be required for a clinical study, patient size, what kind of endpoints and things like that would be, it would definitely be a good time to go ahead and do a pre-submission with FDA. You can start off with just an introductory meeting to talk about your device if you're not ready for like the full review my clinical protocol. There's a lot of different information in the pre-submission guidance document that can be helpful. So you can kind of have an informal meeting where you introduce your product, talk about it high level. You're not expecting written feedback from FDA, just kind of some, brainstorming and time together to talk about it. If you do feel like your clinical data is robust, you might want to talk to, or your preclinical data is robust, you may want to talk to them about, this is my testing plan and things like that to move into your clinical study. Or you can actually talk about the clinical study protocol. You're definitely going to want to have FDA to review that because you don't want to start on a clinical study that's not going to get you the outcome that you're looking for or have enough information for FDA in your PMA submission.
Amazing. Okay, we have time. Let's do digital health.
Okay. I will keep going if I can make it move.
And while
Okay.
you're at move, the last question we'll answer before we do digital health
Okay.
is a question on do you need to have a company formed to go through FDA steps or could it be done prior to incorporation?
It can be done pre-submissions. really anything can be done prior to incorporation. Pre-submissions are pretty routine from universities and very, very early formed companies. If you are wanting to pay a user fee, like I was talking about, and get the small business discount, your company is going to have to be formed. You're going to have to show a tax return at that point. But because there's no fee associated with the pre-submission, you want to introduce yourself, you want to ask some very specific questions, or maybe talk about regulatory strategy. You don't have to be fully formed at that point. I've certainly sent some in over the years with like a lab name or person's name or things along those lines. So you don't have to be official in that sense for that original feedback.
Awesome.
Okay, so the other topic for today is kind of digital health regulation. This is a high level overview. It's changing all of the time, but a lot of people are in digital health space. So I'm glad we have time to go through this because I'm talking so fast. So a lot of the digital health regulations started with the 21st Century Cures Act, which is from 2016. And this was to kind of help differentiate some of the things that are considered medical devices and some of the things that aren't going to be regulated as medical devices, but are still kind of in the space or adjacent to the space, like medical software, I think EMR systems. If you look at this second bullet here, there's a lot of different things, administrative functions at a healthcare facility, healthy lifestyle, think Fitbit, step tracker, things along those lines. That provide some kind of they're medical, but they're not deeply medical, I guess I would say, that were truly considered to be a medical device at one point. This is kind of the act that said those don't need to go through all this process. Like those are no longer going to be considered to be medical devices or regulated as medical devices. If you go to the FDA website, there's all sorts of categories on things that fall underneath digital health. There's a lot of topics through them. Software is a medical device, so maybe something that uses an off-the-shelf type iPhone or something to collect information. Maybe it's an algorithm in a cloud where an image is fed in, where there's additional information that's figured out. There are software as a medical device where there's not necessarily a item itself that's regulated. AI and ML, there's a lot of different information about that right now, and FDA expectations for data sets and development and clinician validation. There's all sorts of guidance documents and web pages about that. Cybersecurity is a big topic with FDA. They've really, in the last few years, upped their game on what's required for cybersecurity to just ensure not just a lot of people, I think about like personal information, just to make sure that everything is secure, especially in life-sustaining devices and things, that, hacking and things could be a potential issue. There's more information about mobile medical apps and what is considered a mobile medical app, what's regulated, what's not regulated, interoperability, wireless medical devices. There's a lot of requirements. Doesn't matter if your quality of service is down. Is your critical information not going to get to a clinician when they need it? Or it's not a big deal if information sends once a week instead of within a minute or whatever it may be. So software as a medical device, these are some just examples of these categories from the FDA website. Some examples of software as a medical device. It has a medical purpose, but it doesn't necessarily include hardware for that medical device. So a software that collects a large amount of data from different sources and transforms it into like a 3D model could be software as a medical device. It's analyzing a heart rate intended for clinician to help diagnose an arrhythmia, like the algorithm on the Apple Watch for those who have it for the ECG information and arrhythmias is software as a medical device. My entire watch is not considered a medical device, but that particular aspect of it is regulated as one. Mobile medical apps. So they keep revising this. You can see 2013, 15, 19, and 22. They keep updating the guidance document with different things that are coming out, but mobile medical apps that can be considered medical devices or perform medical functions are included in this. And it talks a lot about different examples and things and different types of mobile medical apps and which ones are regulated and which are not. Another big topic area of the last few years has been clinical decision support software. So software where maybe a clinician is entering in information and getting some sort of medical information back. Maybe it's a diagnosis, maybe it's just an average of glucose. It can be all sorts of different things, but there's a long list to figure out if you have a software that is considered clinical decision support, how that information is regulated with FDA. Generally, these are listed on here, but it's not things that include like images. It's more textual information, I would say. It may display it, it may trend it, it might provide a recommendation, but ultimately it's the clinician that's making the decision in the end, and they're not relying on this software to give them information that they couldn't have figured out themselves. It's convenient for them to use it. AI and ML, I will say that there is a FDA database now that is lovely that contains any 510K or I believe PMAs as well that have used artificial intelligence or machine learning as part of their development process. There's not a lot of medical devices out there that are just gathering data and iterating on data in an AI sense, but there are a lot of products out there that are going back to FDA with additional data sets or larger data sets to refine their algorithms that they use within their products. But typically those algorithms are static when they're out there in the world. And there's tons of guidance documents on that. Here's some examples of some of the things that FDA has that use AI or ML. An imaging system that uses algorithms to give diagnostic information for skin cancer in patients. It might look at an image and say, I would check out these particular spots or whatever it may be. Smart sensor that estimates probability of a heart attack, probably also based off machine learning in that sense. And it is all levels of risk, well, mostly class 2 and class 3 products, but all different types of submissions have used AI and ML in their development process. MDDS, I don't know that we need to talk about, but display of medical information and how that is regulated. If you are sending an image from monitor 1 to monitor 2, you don't want something to morph, you don't want to lose resolution, things along those lines. There's a lot of information about just electronic transfer of medical information, and this guidance document covers that. It talks about displaying things. Maybe you see it on your mobile application and then you want to look at it at a portal at a later time. It needs to be the same information and correct and nothing get mixed up between APIs or whatever it may be on the way over there. So there's a lot of information about that. And I think that's it.
Amazing. And the question we have in the chat is, what are your thoughts on digital health and patent trolls?
So I don't really know the patent space particularly well. Like it's interesting, right? Because I have a lot of new clients that I work with that are like, "Oh, I can send you my patent." And I'm like, "Well, your patent is explaining how you are different from everything, and I want to explain how you are substantially equivalent or similar to things." So I don't really touch the patent world, and I don't know that piece of it. So
Awesome. I have a question since we still have a little bit of time. What can you tell any stories of maybe situations where you collaborated with a team and they really should have gotten their regulatory assessment or gone down their path and evaluated that like way before they did a whole bunch of work that they did, and then now they're in a space where now they're going to have to either completely change or pivot or change what they've done in the past?
um I have one from a while ago that kind of popped in mind when you said that. It meets some of that criteria, but not all of that criteria. It was a lower risk device, probably class 2, possibly class 1. But the company had decided, because they had a lot of great information and a lot of testing done on the product, like, and they had a CE mark, because how you classify medical devices in Europe is different. It's a little more logical process based on invasiveness and series of different questions and things, versus this substantial equivalence concept, which is only for the US and FDA. And so they were like, well, our predicate device isn't very clear, but we have all of our testing information. So I was like, we really need to ask FDA about predicate device, or potentially figure out classification before we go into this paid submission. And yes, I know your data is great, but we have to get the substantial equivalence checkbox, and there's not really anybody like you out in the US. And it was like, well, we don't want to take the time, because we already have our testing, to go through the pre-submission process and talk to FDA about that. And so we just went in with our best predicate guess, which was not necessarily the greatest. And FDA, even though they had great technical information, said no. And it ended up hanging us up. If we had just done the pre-submission and gotten that feedback before we did the 510K, we probably would have had a shorter time frame and a more open conversation than just submitting it and hoping it worked out, knowing it might not. And it didn't. And we ended up having to do multiple pre-submissions, in the middle of it, and then going back again and submitting the 510K information. So, even though they felt like they were ready, it's just not always a logical, fully predictable process in that sense. So we really should have been talking to them first before doing that submission.
I love that example because I think also in the conversation, for example, a great conversation yesterday at Portal that Georgia MEP team did, and the thoughts and the experiences for like quality systems and like teams that think, oh, I'll just wait until later when I'm too busy doing the science on my baby right now. I'll wait until later to do those key steps. And it really can have a significant time delay and cost implication.
Right. And catching up, especially in the quality system area. And I mean, it'll come out sometimes, but not always, in the 510K process. If you don't know all of your design inputs and user needs, then you may not be testing everything that's needed. And FDA may come up with something like, hey, you didn't test this, and you realize, like, my device isn't going to pass that the way that it's designed, and you have to make a design iteration or something, which is going to cause you to have to redo a lot of testing or make a lot of justifications. And the easiest, cleanest submissions are the ones that don't have all of those justifications and all of those different, well, it wasn't really the final finished product, but it's okay because, like, do I do that? Yes. Sometimes you can't repeat $100,000 testing. So you have to have a risk-based approach as to why it's still applicable, but it is good to get the ducks, in a row up front, so you don't get stuck in those situations, because it's just difficult and it doesn't look great.
Awesome. Totally agree. Okay. Our last two questions, and one I think they can email you for, but it's
Sure.
if you could share the typical fees for class one, class two device consultations. That's that question. But the one that I think ties to what you were just saying is how does a newbie who has zero thoughts about FDA procedures begin this journey for their device? Who do they reach out to, when, and what are the advice and pitfalls? I think we have time for that question. And then
Yeah.
they can email you for the cost for the consultations.
Yeah. Um, So, I mean, when to get started, I think it's my prior slide for this. Like, you definitely need to understand what your device is going to be used for and some of your basic kind of design to really be able to do that product. I mean, it's good to understand. I mean, Google is your friend, looking at people's press releases on their type of submission for your competitors, whatever it may be, just searching their name with FDA beside it, or products that are in the space, to see if they did a clinical study or see, what classification they are. usually can be found relatively easily at kind of a high level, so that's a good place to start. You probably have a feel for whether you're very, very high risk, in which case you're going to need a lot of money and time to get to the market. For some of the class one and class twos, and certainly software and mobile medical apps and these type things, the devil's in the details, but really understanding what your plan is for what your device is intended to do and some of those basic design features is usually enough to get a feel for it.
Awesome. Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I am going to remind everyone to please take I'm trying to get my screen up to show this. Please take a moment to go and visit both our um both our Facebook page, our LinkedIn page, and our YouTube page for Biolocity to make sure that you stay in the loop about upcoming events so that you can also see, as I mentioned, the recording. We will share the recording. It will be on our YouTube channel. Please go ahead and subscribe now, and you'll be able to then share it. We also have a lot of other videos on there, I believe over 50 videos that have experts from all areas talking about everything to do taking your product from bench to market. Now, I know that each one of you is super busy. Thank you for spending some time with us today. And our next session will be towards the end of May. It'll be on VC funding and getting money for your startup. So make sure that you stay in the loop so that you can find out that information and attend.